Good. Industry 4.0 probably want the first hyperlinks inside there. Okie dokie. Let's rock on, as we say. And here we are, lo and behold, ready for another week. What are we on now? Is this week 8? I think it is. And we're flying through the stuff. So tonight, Matthew, as I keep saying that, I'll have to stop that. It's an old joke by now. We'll start looking at finance, budgets, and financial planning. It's pretty light going, trust me. Okay, folks, we'll get down to the PowerPoints and see how we're doing. And yeah, let's move over a little bit more so as we can see the screen. So as I mentioned, project costs and budgets, and like everything else, it's almost like every lecture, I'd say these things are important, but this will help you with the fundamentals of the second assignment, because it's it feeds directly into the second assignment and building your earned value chart. It's all built around costings for all intents and purposes. So let's take a trip down the costing road and see how we get on. Now, there's a bit of a throwaway, but generally speaking, you'll have bids for projects, whether you're accepting them or tendering a bid for a particular project. As I say, if you're bidding on a project, you want to bid as low as possible and still make a profit. You know the old saying, if you spend peanuts, isn't that it? You get monkeys. And generally speaking, low bids will more than likely compromise quality. It will certainly compromise time and so on, generally speaking. Sometimes it may be worth your while to go in with a low bid just to get a reference site. That would be very common within telecoms and IT and platforms and new launches of new technology as such. Go in low, hoping to get a good site such that you'll have a reference to engage with more customers. And indeed, It's not uncommon that companies would actually give away perhaps their hardware just so as they could make the money on the services that sit on top of the hardware, for example. And then if you're accepting bids on a project, do you want to accept the lowest bids? That might be one of the cases where, yes, I'll accept this low bid, but I know I'm going to be paying for the services later. It's a simplified example would be you buy a printer today, you're getting it for virtually half nothing, but in actual fact, you're paying for the cartridges over the lifetime of the printer, and that's where they make their money. They virtually give away the printers. Same for your mobile phones, contract mobile phones and so on. They're sold cheaper than they're actually costing the companies themselves. But because you're in contract, they're going to recoup that money over X number of months, and then they're in profit after that. That's why you might consider, we'd say, accepting lower bids. But generally speaking, when we're looking at budgets themselves, we allocate scarce resources. It implies constraints, people, equipment, money, and thus it implies that managers will not get everything that they want and or that they need. So there's going to be a rationing. So think of it in this context that the budget is a purse of money available to the company. It's a cake. It has to be divvied out. How many slices do you want to divvy it out into? That depends on the competing projects, for example, from whatever part of the organization. So there's limited funding to a point. There may be, let's say, for argument's sake, there may be 5 million in the bank account, so to speak, of the company. Does that mean that's all they have available? Excuse me. Does that mean they only have 5 million? Not necessarily. They may decide to borrow from the bank. They may decide to invest or ask investors to spend a little bit more money, invest more money into the company, maybe another 2-3 million for argument's sake. So technically, they may have 8 million available to them for this financial year. Why would they do that? If it was strategically important for the company, particular technology project that they need to get involved in, upgrading their production systems, introducing a whole new technologies into their organization to keep them competitive, or at least get a competitive advantage. So these might be the reasons that they say we'll spend above and beyond, so we have to borrow money from to fund these additional projects. That may be the case. So you're, as I say, you're not just limited to the retained profits inside the company. They'd like to not to have to borrow. So it's another cost that they'd have to factor into the project when we talk about these later on. So the budget for an activity also implies management support for an activity. And the higher the budget relative to cost, the higher the managerial support. A bit of a throwaway comment, but yes, kind of brings in the politics, but it gets more attention. If it's a large slice of the cake, then management, senior management, are going to be watching this very, very closely. Most likely because they want to see that their investment is on target, is going to pay off for itself, and it was a good gamble. Because remember, the company will choose amongst a plethora of projects which to fund each year, each quarter, whatever the case may be. So they have to make the right judgment call. And that's where a really good project manager comes into his own. How he pitches the project, how it supports, and so on, helps them make that decision. Hence, when we talked about it last week, these business cases, for all intents and purposes, like a business plan, business case, business model. This is how I'm going to generate new income for the company. This is how I'm going to improve its competitive performance. This is how I'm going to improve its quality, and so on, so on, so on. This is how much it's going to cost you. I'll run this project, and take it from me that if we deliver on this, the company will be better off. It'll hit its strategic objectives. See why I keep bringing in strategic commentary here? The linkage. So if we look down, then the budget is also a control mechanism. So many organizations have controls in place that prohibit exceeding the budget. Absolutely. I mean, depending on the level inside an organization, you can have restrictions on to how much an individual manager department can spend. They'll have constraints inside there, and they'd have to have written approval or authorization to spend above and beyond their budget allocation for that month, that quarter, or an amount. It's a way of keeping fiduciary control in the organization. And then you have comparisons against, but and this is my favorite, the actual versus budget. So your project plan, when you have it costed out, that's your budget. And remember I mentioned it's always going to have that kind of an S curve to it. And that's because it's accumulated. So if your project runs over 9 months, you'll have 9 months accumulative, and it'll have that traditional or classical S curve shape. And then you have to have ways of catching, trapping, finding the actual spend in as close as possible to real time as is necessary for your own reporting as a project manager, but definitely to keep it as current as possible, such that you're not running into accruals and all that sort of accounting terminology and constraints, which makes life a little bit more difficult. But you'd like to be able to get the data as quickly and as accurately as possible, which kind of brings on one of these other problems that we'll see later on. So estimating your project budgets, it's obviously material, labor, equipment, the money you need. This is the borrowings, as I mentioned earlier on. If you have to go to the bank to borrow an extra 2 or 3 million or 200,000 above and beyond what's already available in terms of cash to the company, you may have to borrow, and that'll come at an interest rate. So you'll have that capital, the money, plus the interest rates of it. Plus you'll have overheads, and of course you'll want to have profit. That'll be your ultimate bid. So whatever your margin is, 5%, 10%, 30%, and factor that in, and that becomes your total budget. This is what, so if you were building a shopping center, take all of these costs, and then we expect to make a profit of X amount. Well, let's just say shopping center 120 million, 122 million, and maybe 15 million of that is profit, or maybe 27 million is profit. In any case, that's your final figure, and that's usually the starting or negotiating point. So in other words, when you group all of these together, it's essentially resources plus profit equals the bid or the final cost of the project. And so we're left with the task of forecasting resources. Now, to build those resources and build those costs, that's a real challenge for the project manager, because you need to get this as accurate as possible. That's why I will always say, a good project manager is worth his weight in gold, because he's really good at this. Now, it's not so much that he's doing it on his own, because, as I mentioned previously, products, services have become very, very complex. Therefore, you'll need some help. You might have a lot of experience in particular areas and so on, but you'll definitely need to bring in, certainly if you're introducing any kind of new technologies or new processes that you're not familiar with as a project manager, you'll need to bring in expertise to help you to be able to guess how much each of these activities are going to cost the company. And when you pull all these together, then you have your project plan. And you'll go through a number of iterations of that before you're ultimately happy. So let's take this a step further. So estimating, like any forecast, includes some uncertainty. Of course, because are you going to have the resources you actually look for? The people, the equipment? Probably not. Uncertainty regarding the usage and price, so especially true for material and labor. What you might estimate today for raw materials or components, anything can happen. You take the Red Sea, for example, is just going to shoot up your supply chain costs of particular materials, components coming from the other side of the world for a project that you're running right now or in 6 months' time. Fuel prices, okay, they tend to be coming down at the moment. Hopefully they'll keep going that direction. But anything can kick off. And that's why you need to a whole other subject area of mine is this whole concept of systems thinking. And as a good project manager, you need to be looking at, could this impact me? Could something happen over here that could impact me? Here's something on the news tonight. Middle East is a powder keg. Could this kick off? What if? All this type of scenario planning. What impact could it have on my little project here in the Midlands or on the west of Ireland or east of Ireland in terms of costs? Could it drive up my energy costs? Could it drive up my labor costs? And so on and so on. So these are all the things you need to be able to try and factor in and have some level of assuredness in terms of a figure that you feel, we'll say, comfortable with, in terms of you think you've covered all the scenarios and this is a realistic cost for particular activities, materials and labor and so on. So more experience, the cost estimator, the lower the uncertainty, of course. But again, the cost estimator can look. We used to have a small army of them when I worked in Kent's in Clonmel. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Kent's, electrical contractor. But we used to have a team of purchasing and cost estimators inside in the department, obviously tendering for jobs. Organish, for example, would have been one of them. Kingspan, another one of them. All these large companies, we did all the electrical installations for those massive jobs, and they would have had a team of estimators, and they're trying to get the costings right. And side story for the engineers amongst you, nearly all of you, you have the two types of conduit for running electrical cables through in a factory. And from memory, there's yellow and red tag. And guys used to go in, we'd have a small team of guys going and bending this conduit left, right and center to feed cables through in the, we say, the first fix in these massive plants. And there was one guy, he was known as the conduit king. This guy would lay, kilometers of this stuff over a couple of weeks, and he got his name not because he was so proficient at putting up the conduit, but he put up the wrong label. It should have been fire resistant. He had put up the wrong label, got the labels mixed up, and all had to come down again. Anyway, side story. So we would have had guys had to recover that cost. So experienced cost estimators. Now, in terms of the project manager, you'll have knowledge of your business. It's also another attribute of leadership, that you technically know the business you're in. That's important. So you'd have some idea. Perhaps you've had experience at different roles inside an organization, so you have a better feel for things. But still, that's not good enough. So rules of thumb, some rules of thumb may be adjusted for special conditions, and however, it's still easier than starting an estimate from scratch. I totally disagree with that. I would strongly advise zero-based budgeting. Start from scratch, build your costs, take the time out to build your costs. So finding out, for examples, salaries. If you have these team of people, what are their salaries? More experienced, the lesser experienced, the apprentices, and so on, what levels of salary are they on? What are the light heating costs, transportation costs, whatever your overheads are? I'd build up my whole cost structure from the ground up. You're not accountants. That's where you bring in these guys. You go to the accounts department and say, right, can you explain? Show me these costs. Can you break them down for me? And can you build them up? And so on. Spend that time, and I promise it'll be the best time you ever spent on your project, because you will be on top of everything after that. You'll know precisely every element that builds up your overall project cost. And more importantly, when you're making a presentation or when something goes wrong or when your actual exceeds your budget or is behind budget, you'll know the reasons. There could be, again, midway through your project, there could be some natural disaster. Another, Eyjafjallajökull, that thing up in Iceland, restricts travel. Bang, hits your project potentially. So you can have these costs and change in delays and so on and so on. You'll have the answer, and you can't just blame and say this cost is related to that natural disaster or this is related to supply chain issue that we hadn't foreseen, and or a company has gone out of business and a new competitor has come in the transportation side and you had to pay higher prices. You still need the components. You're going to have to pay a higher price to a transportation company and so on. So you'll have the answers. There's nothing worse than standing in front of a team of sponsors, senior managers, and say, "Can I get back to you on that one? I'll get you the answer to that, or I'll follow up on that." Very unprofessional. Know your stuff going in. Know and be prepared for all sorts of questions. And one of the safeguards is building your structures, your finances from the bottom up, your costs. Now, as I say, your engineers, do I have to learn accounting? Absolutely not. But you know how many hours it's going to take to do this particular task, so on, so on. How much is it costing me to have that person here? So you need to build up those costs. Take a quick finance for non-financial managers course if necessary. But money speaks. And that'll underpin effective project management, and it'll certainly help your careers in that light. So estimating budgets, of course, it's difficult. There might be some historical data, there may not. And you'll also have, you can't just say, what happened in one project is going to work for yours. So many of these points, if not all of them, multiple people have inputs, as a loose comment. These are negated if you do what I suggest on the previous slide. Build your costs from scratch. Whether the data existed or not before is irrelevant. You sit down and you build it from scratch. Whether there's multiple people have input into the budget, doesn't matter. You only pull the people that you need, particularly in the planning phase. You just bring in the finance people and a technical person. If you feel you're short on your technical ability, or maybe on some part of a production line, on some part of the project, this is new stuff to me. I'm not familiar with this. I better call in the Ghostbusters, whoever they are, and someone that has more experience, and say, have you been down this road before? Yes. I need your help on this one to estimate some of the costs. What do you think in this project? Blah, blah. Sometimes the projects can be so big that you will have almost a dedicated technical expert working with you, because they'll have more knowledge, perhaps they've more experience in this space, and they can help you get more realistic estimates. There's one small hiccup with that proposal, and that's oftentimes they will estimate jobs based on their abilities, competence, which means that they could be underestimating, because they maybe Adam can get it done in a week, whereas somebody with lesser experience has probably taken 2.5 weeks, for example, or could take 2 weeks. Therefore, you might be too optimistic if you used the pure technical experts. So there has to be an aggregate. And sometimes it may mean that you talk to the people that are going to be working on the project. Listen, we have this task. This is your area of expertise. How long do you think it'll take you to do this? Invariably, people say, "Oh, geez, Mark, that'll take me about 3.5 weeks." You'll know whether they're trying it on, so to speak. And I say, "Come on, Mark, seriously. Okay, yeah, look, I'll get it done in 2 3/4 weeks instead of 3.5 weeks. Realistically, that's all going well, and there are no hiccups and so on and so forth." So you kind of barter. Even if you have to go to that level, at least you're getting realistic estimates, and your technical supervisor or technical expert on your project can ratify those estimates, and they might say, come back and say, well, these estimates are a little bit on the high side, let's renegotiate and so on. So, but you get the grassroots right, get the estimates as close to what's practicable as possible, realistic estimates. So,
Also
but
bear in mind though, Mark, Adam's not thick, so when it's going to take him half the time, he's going to say it's going to take 80% of the time because he doesn't like the stress.
no, that's an absolute point, because you know, they're not going to always be the how to say, try to be the white-haired boy and say, I can get it done half time, and then take 20% longer and so on.
You have no
So you
wiggle
have
room
to
for fuck-ups.
say again, Alan.
You have no wiggle room for fuck-ups in that case.
No.
And the more experienced you are,
Exactly.
you know you can do it faster, but you err on the side of caution.
Yeah. Which would bring me to one of the points that you always put in a little bit of fat into your projects. And we generally kind of work between around 5-10%, give or take. Leniency depend on the area, and also particularly on the critical path. On the non-critical path items, we might just say give us a 5% wriggle room. On critical path, let's say 7.5 to 10%. We always build in a little bit of headroom onto our activities, our work package estimates. So what else have we here? Multiple people have some control over the budget, particularly if it's dispersed in multiple locations. You'll have local people responsible, and particularly if it's we say multi-location and international. Of course, those people have control of their elements of the budget, and you, as the overall project manager, you could be working with several different departments or locations, and the overall budget has to be an amalgam of these individual sets of budgets. And that way they'll all have their own controls and so on the budgets. So there's more flexibility regarding the estimates of inputs, material and labour. Now the flexibility is what I was alluding to, and Adam, quite rightly said, we need to have a little bit of wriggle room. And that's the flexibility, so that we have time. When we put in wriggle room, we're talking about time. If they say an estimate of 2.5 weeks, worst case 3 weeks, best case 2.25 weeks. In either case, or in any case, we'll have the least probable time and the most probable time that it's going to take, and we take the average of those two times, and then we multiply that by the rate, and that gives us the financial cost of the 2.5 or 3 weeks. Convert that into, let's just say 3 weeks is 40-hour weeks, that's 120 hours. That's the worst case. 2.25 weeks, 40, it's 80 plus 10, 90. So 90 to 120 hours. Multiply that by whatever rate, 60 euros an hour, 200 euros an hour, whatever the rate is. I'll come back to that shortly. And we have here, the accounting system may not be set up to track project data. That would be one of the first things I'd look at. How can I track the data I'm looking? How can I track my hours? Do we have timesheets? Do we have some kind of recording system? And so on, so on. Because if you don't have them in place, then that could be a nightmare to get the actual data in a timely fashion. You'll get it, but will you get it when you need it? At the end of each month, within, we'd say, 2 days of a close off of each calendar month, for argument's sake, and that's when you're running your project report. So accounts close off and we get all the input the following day, for argument's sake. Or can the system give you a live update as to where you are, and with a reasonable level of accuracy? And essentially, do you have systems in place? And of course you'll have, if depending on the size of your organization, you might have any of these enterprise resource planning systems, SAP and so on and so forth, in place. But if you're a small enterprise, same can apply. You could track it on Excel. You could very easily track the hours and get people to send an email of their timesheets, and a project administrator, possibly yourself, you can collate this and multiply out one, pump them into a spreadsheet, and bang, there you have. I know where exactly how my costs are now at this point in time. If you have somebody in finance, they'll generate them for you, and usually we'll have a financial person in your organization, even if they're not a fully qualified accountant. Nevertheless, they'll be able to get you the information relatively quickly. So usage of labor and materials is very lumpy over time. That's a throwaway comment, but the lumpiness comes in. There's only a handful of you in the very start of the project. As you go into the execution phase, that's where you begin to get more people, use materials, more equipment, and so on. During the execution phase, that's when it becomes kind of lumpy. A lot more people, a lot more tracking, control, and so on. And then as you get towards the end of the project, most of those resources are released. It's just the final touches, clean up, and so on. You have only a handful of people, and you get this curve. Now, generally, we have three types of budgeting: top down, bottom up, and negotiated. Sometimes we call this negotiated the middle out, which is a mix between bottom up and top down. Now, I'll fly through these because they're pretty self-explanatory. Top down, top managers. Here's the figure you've got to work with. Trickle down through all the different departments and so on. So the process continues down to the bottom level, down to team level for argument's sake in the organization. So the company might say for new technology projects, we're allocating 3.5 million. That's it. So how many new technology projects could be running? Could be one in the IT, there could be one in operations, there could be several in different parts of the operations itself, depending on the size of the organization. There could be something coming up in maybe a new HR system for better tracking and training of people. It could be introducing some AI training, for argument's sake, virtual recording and virtual induction and all that. So all of these possible new technology initiatives could be competing for that 3.5 million. But nevertheless, that's what the company senior management said is available. The advantages: overall budgets can be set, control very accurately. Arguable. Management has more control over budgets, because they're holding the purse strings. There is an old saying, it's very valid still today: he who controls the money controls the company. And to an extent, that can be true. But generally speaking, it's the senior management want to have visibility of how much money is being spent and where it's being spent, and do not need to do as much upfront planning. Why? Because they just say, this is the budget, work within that constraint. And I've seen that used in one or two pharmaceutical companies, and it was bordering between the hilarious and the outlandish in terms of the number of iterations they would said. Senior management said, these are the budgets, trickle down. The lower end or actually worse again, it was bottom up, and it got up to the top, and with the amalgamated budgets, and the senior manager said, back to the drawing board, we can't accept that. And it went through this loop several times. I said, Jesus, the amount of time they were wasting in that particular organization. I'll not name who they are. So disadvantages: more difficult to get buy-in, of course, because it's a diktat from the top down. When people are not involved, it becomes frustrating. We get approval for part of our project, for 3/4 of it, whatever the case may be, but we can't do the rest. It's a high demotivator. Leads to low-level competition for larger shares of the budget. Internal competition. Some people might say that's healthy. Not necessarily.
I'd add another one to that, Mark, as well.
Yes,
you
Adam?
actually don't get full transparency across your budgets, because what ends up happening, especially if you use the pharma case there, so they might have a site-wide budget with different capital allocations for different types of initiatives or projects. And what happens is, on the projects, they rob Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah.
They basically shift money around, hours around between projects. So you never actually get full visibility on what's actually happening in your organization.
Absolutely. No, it's a very good point, because it also makes life extremely frustrating for the project managers and project leaders, or even the managers responsible for those respective budgets. And yeah, don't work. So bottom-up budgeting, the flip side of it, broken down into work packages. Low-level managers price out each work package, and overhead and profits are added to develop the budget. I'd be leaning towards this, simply again because it still supports the contention that you have to build your costs from the ground up to arrive at your first level budget, and then you add your overheads and so on to this. This is where you bring in your finance people to give you better or more realistic numbers as such. So advantages: greater to buy-in by low-level managers, and more likely to catch unusual expenses. See my point about building your budgets from the bottom up, and zero-based budgeting approach. You'll catch any of those curveballs that you might not have seen, in, from a financial perspective at least. And as you're going through that process of talking to people, talking to your team, your project team, in terms of estimating, we'll call it truthful and realistic time for each activity. People are bought in, they're committed, they can see what's happening. And it is a really good motivator, not to be continuously harping on about these soft skills, but people can see that, yes, this is my contribution, and this is how, and this is my work. And more importantly, if they see that this is the project they're going to be working on, this is how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost, there's a level of commitment because there's clarity. They can see what they're going to be doing for the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and so on. Whereas, like, for all intents and purposes, me getting a timetable at the start of the semester, now I can say, this is where I have to commit to my hours. Monday night, Wednesday night, other days in the week, these are my hours. So it settles down. The first couple of weeks, it's mayhem, change, but at least in time after that, they settle down and we'll get into it. And you have, when you have that routine set up, then people get on with it. And it's the same with these budgets. When they know when they're bought into the project, they know how their time has been used. But also, it provides an opportunity. Well, Mark would like to try something a little bit different this time around. Maybe take on a new activity or step up to the next level. Are there opportunities? And these become a little bit more visible in upcoming projects, which also provide a nice level of buy-in. And of course, as Adam was alluding to it, we do have a little bit of overstatement and padding. So management tend to cut the budget, at the senior level. Now, that's, when we're talking, it's trust and respect. So if you go purely from the bottom up and say, this is going to take us 10 months and it's going to cost us 1.1 million, senior manager look at it and say, on your bike, Mark, we want it done in 8 months, and it needs to come in 900,000 euros or less, kind of thing. So back to the drawing board. That's
where I find that works very well is, look, when you do build from the bottom up, you do get the buy-in, and people do pad it, and there's an awareness on both sides that it's padded. It's up to the PM to push people as much as they can to kind of get them to, all right, I can do it for that. But when people are at a hard no, that's it. But like overall, that's the most effective and most accurate way I've seen, especially when you're forecasting and estimating projects.
That's exactly it, Adam. Because as a respectable project manager, you're not going to allow people to gild the lily, to use the expression. In other words, pad it to the ultimate and have an easy life. There is an expectation that you'll talk to the guys locally and say, come on, Mark, you're stretching a bit here. These are the kind of time frames, and you'll eventually get to that median level. So you'll have realistic lower and upper estimates, and you'll aim for the middle, generally speaking. But when you've collated all of those, then you're confident in those numbers that when you go up to your sponsors and your project managers or the senior managers and so say, these are realistic numbers. This is going to cost you 1.25 million and it's going to take 10 months. And they'll say, but Mark, no, these are the numbers and you have your backup to all of this. And they'll say, well, we need to come in at, I can't remember the numbers I was making up. Let's just say we need to come in at 950,000. You have to have the I won't say the strength, but the professionalism to say, fine, I'll give it to you for 950,000. I'll drop it from 1.5 million down to 950, or 1.1 million down to 950,000. But we'll have to sacrifice or take out this feature, that feature, or a combination of these two features. And that's the only way I can reduce the cost of the budget and the time as a consequence. And they say, but no, we can't. Look, you've hired me as a project manager to give you the most realistic and project plan as possible. And this is it. And you have to be able to negotiate, let's just say. And that's your form of negotiation. If you're confident of the numbers going in to a senior management meeting for approval of the final budget or a project, then you're in that negotiating position with a level of confidence. And none of this, oh, let me go in, I'll see if I can check. You can say, yes, we'll cut this feature and that feature, or we'll defer that feature onto a later date and we go with this package, bundle of work packages for the moment. And then we go back down to the realistic budget. That's the importance, and that's why I say a good project manager is worth his weight in gold. He can argue and present a cogent plan based on a bottom-up. So just looking briefly at these work element costings, labour rates include overhead and personal time. And then direct costs usually do not include overhead, and then general administration. These are just general groupings. Normally, what we can do in when we're estimating, again, it'll depend on the industry, but you can bundle all your costs into what we often refer to as the man-hour cost. Probably can't even say that nowadays. Person-hour cost. I'm not even going there. But the man-hour cost, and that would have how much on average does it cost to have these employees in our company working on a 40-day week, for argument's sake. What's the hourly rate on average? You can drill it down based on because you can skew the figures. If you have very experienced people working the project, then your average man-hour cost might be a little bit higher, but you can work on that. And then we'd have all the equipment they might be using. If it's regular equipment, let's just say for just for the purpose of demonstration, we're talking here that they're using computers. How much do these computers cost? The rate of depreciation, the licenses we have on these computers for the different applications, the CAD/CAM applications might be using, and so on, so on, so on. Licensing for SAP and all this. And we factor all of these in. And then we'd have the general administrative costs. Actually, no, come back. Even staying with the overhead costs. Light heat. How much is the company paying on insurance and so on for to have that person here in the company? And you'd be surprised how it all adds up. So if you're getting, 25 euros an hour, that's your rate of pay, and after tax you're taking home 10 euros probably. But if you're on 25 euros, it's probably costing the company somewhere in the region of 60 euros an hour to have you there working, maybe a little bit more, when you take into account all of the expenditure the company is. I mean, you're talking about the building itself, depreciation, the light heating costs, and so on. And then you'd have administrative costs. You might have people working in HR, in finance, and so on, that they'd be charging out their time onto your. So when you aggregate all of these independent costs together, you can come up with a nice global figure known as the man-hour cost. And every activity is multiplied by that man-hour cost, and you have a consistency through your project in terms of the costing. That's why I'm coming back to it again. Working your costs from the zero base upwards, you get to see what all of these elements that contribute to the cost, the budgeting costs of your projects. So negotiated budgets. Most projects use some combination of top-down, which I've already mentioned beforehand. And generally speaking, yes, we'd have, and you probably, as a project manager, will be doing the negotiation here. You'll be up and down saying, look, these are our costs here, and they'll say, well, we have to reduce our time and our budget here and this. And they say, yeah, well, this is if you want to take out these features and drop these requirements, postpone this and postpone that, then we can work within these. And then eventually you come to an agreement where you say, yes, we'll have 9 of the 10 original requirements, and we'll deliver 2 weeks earlier instead of the 5 weeks later than the original deadline, and so on. So we come to a compromise. Essentially, that's your negotiated budget. Now and you get sign off. Make sure they all sign along the dotted line, say this is the finally agreed budget, and so on. Both are prepared and compared. Any difference are negotiated, of course. So, category of budgeting versus program and activity budgeting. Kind of a throwaway topic or learning objective in this context, but anyway, organizations are used to budgeting and collecting data by activity. Essentially, man-hour cost or work cost, production hours, timesheets, man-hour time recording for individuals, and so on. These are comprised of line items in the budget. Examples include phone, utilities, and direct labor. I think there is an example coming up of what a structure of a costing might look like, and you would see all of these things. I mean, I just looked at our set of accounts and there at the weekend, and I'm only ever interested in the operating profit or loss. I don't care about the rest of the financial stuff, tax and all that sort of stuff, and interest and borrowings and crap like that. I'm just interested in show me what's happening in the company right now. And you'll have all of these, marketing costs, transportation, carriage, for example, in or out. If you're charging it as an expense, technically it should be up in the cost of sales, or you'll have also motor expenses, travel expenses, and so on, so on. All of these cost centers or cost codes that will make up your standard cost centers in your organization. And there may be something new that you want to add in, and you talk to finance and you create a new cost code and say, yes, this is how we track it. So any invoices or charges to that code are tracked against your project, for argument's sake. So projects need to accumulate data and control expenses differently. Don't quite agree with that point. There should be a consistency inside the organization. How else are you going to compare projects? If you have different systems for each project, not going to work, and it's unlikely. I'd struggle to find an example that would qualify that point, actually. So it ends up, you could have, let me retract that. You could have, for argument's sake, you could have some kind of internal project. So you're not going to make a profit on it, but it's going to cost you, say, man hours and equipment and so on. It could be a new product introduction, new product development. It could be a new process line. It could be an extended product line or production line for different end products and so on. These are all internal. It could be a internal quality program that needs a project that needs funding. It could be something up in IT, and then you have pure customer projects. So you can classify your project, but as long as you have a classification, fundamentally the same man-hour cost will apply, whether you're working on an internal project or for a customer, because we don't build in the profit. We're talking about the cost of having these resources utilized, not the profit side of it. And here is a kind of an example of these actual versus budgets. So you see management fees, partnership reimbursement, property management, owner acquisitions, so on. And then you look at your operating costs, salaries, payroll taxes, group insurance, medical advice, insurance, and so on and so on. Staff bonuses, all the way down, travel and expenses. So what else have you got? Promotion, legal fees, accounting fees, temporary or out contract sourced work. What's not included there, likes of light heating, and so on and so on. Printing, stationery. What else goes in there? Yeah, anything that can be charged to your project, especially hired equipment, licenses, royalties, whatever the case may be. And what we do, if we go, let me kind of go back a little bit there and highlight this. And if we go back here, you see there you have an actual and a budget and a variance. And this is what I'm talking about. When you do your budgets and there's a variance, we get our actual figures in, you'll have a variance over here. So 1,188 is the variance here on this. That could have been due to some overtime payment. Your actual has gone up. Why? So you're able to explain and say the reason why my actual is ahead of budget is because we had to work some additional overtime. Some components or raw materials or activities were delayed, and we had to work overtime to catch up and keep the project on time. That could be a reason, but at least you'll know why. Now, if you take your costs, your estimates here, in week 1, then in week 2, we have these tasks that are carried out. So you did the bulk of your planning here, which was your 5,600, could be hours, but here we're talking about budgets. That's the cost. And then we had a little bit of final planning there in week 2, sign off and so on. And then we start into activities, tasks and so on down along here. And as you can see, we're carrying out these tasks. Task B is done. We started some of the work once we got approval on the requirements and got clarification on the requirements and so on. Task B, C, and D, we're able to start them. And as you can see, finish out task B on week 3. Task C finished out on week 4. We did the bulk of it in week 3, and task D was finished in week 3, for example. And then you look at clearly task E couldn't start until at least task B or task D were finished. Then we were able to start on task E, and that takes 3 weeks. And because you see how this is beginning to take shape. Ultimately, and then in week 8, which we'll say with the final testing and release of it, was 6,000 euros, and that happened all in week 8. We launched the product, and that was task J, and you can see that the overall was 75,000. And if you accumulate each of these weeks here, if you take 5, 6 plus the 12, 6, what if you've got 17, 18, 2, add that to the 15, that's 28, 33, 1, and so on, so on. If you, the final accumulated figure down here under week 8 will also be 75,000. Okay, and when you plot that accumulated figure, that will give you the S curve that I've been talking about all the time. Now, this is quite important, what these two particular slides and in terms of the message it's trying to convey, because this is the backbone of your second assignment, understanding earned values. So, improving the process of cost estimation, pretty straightforward stuff. Inputs from a lot of areas are required to estimate a project. Yeah, different functions depending on the complexity of the project. Many have a professional cost estimator or a technical expert working with you. The project manager will work closely with the estimator or the technical expert and primarily interested in estimating direct costs to the project itself. Then they'll go to finance to get the indirect, and as I said, not such a major concern. And usually these there could be a way of distributing these costs. Let's just say we're looking at the light and heat costs inside and for your project. Your project might be 17% of the total budget available to the company. So they might apportion 17% of the light heat costs. Or you have 20 people out of 100 people are going to work on your project. Therefore, 1/5 of those costs are allocated. And again, you would negotiate these depending on the structure, but ultimately you only take your share of the cost. So problems, even with careful planning, estimates are wrong. After all I've been saying, it throws a spanner in the works. But yes, they can go wrong. So most firms add 5 to 10% for contingencies. The wriggle room or the padding, call it what you will. And here's one for you. When I ran a project office, I was chief project officer for Technoman, and I had nearly 18 project managers in total working for me, and I had various levels of requirements for them. So the more experienced guys, for their annual appraisals, they were allowed between a 5% plus or minus swing on their project budgets. The lesser experience would have been in around the 10% and so on. And if they failed to meet those figures, they got pretty much didn't get a great appraisal. Why? Because they were hired as project managers, and it was a core competency was to be able to estimate and budget their projects professionally and accurately. And woe betide the inexperienced guy who would come up to me, after 4 months working on project and say, Mark, I'm after saving X amount on this project. I'm 3 weeks early, or I'm a month early. Can I have a clap in the back? More like a 4x2 across the back of the head, because you're way off. That could have been equivalent to maybe 17, 18, 20% of the budget, depending on the size of the original budget and time frame. Problem was that if they were finishing a month early and saving this money, when we were allocating the project at the start and project resource at the start of the year, it meant that now I could have used that money that this person was saving, project manager was saving, for another project. So you see the complications, and because it comes down to choice and availability of resources, and if you can't accurately plan and resource a project, then you're depriving other possibilities for the company, that something that might not appear as important or was just under the line for consideration could have been brought forward and actioned in this quarter, half year, or in the third quarter, because the resources are now available. Anyway, that's how it worked with me. So other bidding factors, escalation, cost. I think escalation is just a polite way of saying gone out of control. We've already talked about these types of projects previously. Waste, of course, goes on inside, and of course you can have bad luck. Weather in construction, for example, or you could have bad luck that a competitor launched faster than you did. So making better estimates. Projects are known for being over budget. It's unlikely that this is due to deliberate underestimating. Unlikely. It can happen that they can be underestimated if you have some, overzealous new project manager who's trying to curry favor with senior management and promising the sun, moon, and stars, and that happens. and they might come down to the project team and say, you know, we only have 10 weeks to complete this budget. He may have already agreed 12 weeks with the senior management, who originally, the original estimate might have been 14 weeks, and say, right, okay, we'll whittle it back to 12 weeks. And he goes down to the project team and says, now we're going to have to work our butts off and do it in 10 weeks to make him look good. Don't fall into that trap. If they ever find out, which they will, your career is pretty much sunk. They'll never trust you again. You'll never win back that team. But unfortunately, it can happen for, as I said, particularly for newbies on the block. Two types of errors, random and systematic, and there is nothing we can do about random errors, but we can do certain things about systematic errors, you know, because we'll go through a risk analysis and we'll find out what's causing these systematic errors, usually down to process failure and so on. Random errors are usually generated externally and cause problems for the project itself. And folks, you'd be delighted to know that's the end of tonight's show. But again, you know, it's a light touch and feel on project estimates and the financial side of it. But it really isn't much more complicated than I've already described. Once you know your sources, and I will admit a certain bias, because, you know, I would have originally come from a cost and management background in accountancy, but it was a learning or a knowledge that served me very, very well as a project manager subsequently, because, as I said, it's the one language that certainly all managers in an organization speak, and senior managers will certainly understand. And the basic questions: how much is it going to cost me? When will I have it? And how much profit am I going to make? And if you can package that in a very professional manner, then 9 out of 10 times your projects are going to succeed, or at least your bid for support for particular projects are going to succeed. But as I said, there's a lot of work goes into getting it to that level. The trusty old spreadsheet, you can't beat it. No matter what comes off your systems, you know, if you can collate everything to get a handle, and more importantly, as a project manager, that you can get a good night's sleep, because you know you've done the homework, you know you've done the planning, and things will go wrong. It's like everything, like every good plan, something goes wrong, and it most certainly will. Whether it is random or systematic, something will throw a spanner, or someone gets up and leaves, someone gets a better job elsewhere, could be one of your key staff. You know, panic might set in. We, in one organization, we're midway through a project, and my boss and a number of the top layer of technical people decided to leave and form a new company, startup, and they it was just pure techie people, and of course there were certain panic stations had kicked in around, and I just said to the guys, no, I said, just great opportunity for you guys to step up to the plate and you know, take on the challenges. And they did, in fairness to them. It didn't take too much encouragement, but there were one or two, you know, how to say, doomsday people shouting off in the company, but pretty much put that to bed as quickly as possible, you know, and say, look, okay, we have to drop our expectation levels and we'll rebuild over time. And we did, you know. Always look on the bright side, isn't that what Life of Brian's movie says? So how are we doing time-wise? Jeez, we're not doing too bad at all. I have something coming in on chat. A good plan today is better than perfect plan tomorrow. Absolutely. Good plan today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. But a reasonably good plan. Okay, folks. I won't delay you any longer. Any other questions, comments, or insults even at this point? No?
Just on the second assignment, is Is that the final one that's up there, or are you going? I think you said you were going to change it, or you were thinking about it, or
I think I'll leave it as is, Adam. We can talk through it closer. Well, not too much closer, but yeah, give you a bit of breathing space. But yeah, I think I'll stick pretty much to the one that's there.
sound?
And I know there will be. Sorry, Adam.
No, I said sound. Thanks.
Now I know there will be a couple of questions there. I will clarify some of the how to say potential pitfalls. How about that? There's one nasty red herring in there, but all in due course. Don't panic. Okay, folks. On that note, and now that my project stuff is working more efficiently, I'll let you off, and I'll see you next week, please God. Okay.
Thanks.
Take it easy, folks.
Thanks, Mark.
Cheers, Mark. Thanks.